Hi, and welcome to your Solomon segment. This segment is all about Tier 1 instruction. As we know, Tier 1 instruction should reach 80 to 85% of the students that you teach. Tier 1 instruction would be those highly effective teaching strategies that we will use so we can have quality instruction that meets the needs of most of our learners. So, when we are giving Tier 1 instruction, we always want to think about the big three. And what are the big three? Well, first, you want to give your students a learning target. They definitely need to know what they are learning. What is my goal? Second, you want to make sure that your students have relevance. They need to understand why they're learning this. And third, you want to make sure the students understand how they will know that they have learned the information. And that comes in the form of success criteria and assessments. So, giving the students the success criteria gives them the guide on how they're going to reach their learning target, and the relevance gets them engaged in learning. So, as you are planning your lessons, you want to think about some core Tier 1 instructional strategies that you can utilize. Strategy 1, you want to make sure that you are activating prior knowledge. Strategy 2, you also want to ensure that you are constantly checking for understanding. Strategy 3, you want to make sure that you are improving student engagement through flexible and collaborative groups, whether that be face to face or online. And strategy 4, you want to differentiate instruction, which you can do in 4 different ways. So let's delve into each one of these strategies. The first strategy is to activate the prior knowledge and make sure the students have a good background and understanding of what the content and the topic is that you're going to cover for that particular lesson. So, research does show that students are more in tune and more engaged when they have some type of understanding of the content that you are going to cover. And if your students do not have understanding, it's up to you as the educator to help build that background knowledge. One way that you can do this is by giving the students a flipped classroom model to where you can give them the content, they can watch videos, read articles, and different things like that prior to coming to your class so that when they come to your class, they already have some knowledge of the subject. And as they walk through the door, you can see how much knowledge they have by giving them an entry ticket or something of that nature where they can describe what they learned from the videos and the content and articles and the readings that you gave them previously. One thing that you can think about when you look at activating prior knowledge are the different ways that you can actually check for understanding with your students. So you can use things like think, pair, share, accountable talk, misconception analysis. What was it that you understood and what was it that you didn't understand? These are all ways that you can assess the background knowledge that your students acquired. Once you have activated the prior knowledge and you've checked for understanding by having your students do some of those activities we previously mentioned, you want to make sure that your students are highly engaged in the lesson. So when you're planning your lesson, you want to make sure you give the students engaging activities. Think about your ratio of teacher talk versus student talk. How much active learning have you written into your lesson versus passive learning? And when you're doing this, you're also meeting the needs of all of your learners, no matter what their learning style is. Want to point out is that active student engagement, it means that you as the educator are creating opportunities for the students to learn and be active with a purpose. And when you create that purpose and that instructional purpose and it's still active, you will minimize behavioral challenges that you may see in your students. It's very rare that a classroom that is engaged in learning has classroom management and behavioral issues emerge. One way to improve the student engagement in your class is to think of it as like a three-way Venn diagram. You have your teacher, you have your student, and you have your content. And you kind of have to make those overlap so that you can have the meaningful engagement in the middle. If you look at the diagram, it shows you that you have to have a relationship, you have to have your expertise, you have to have your relevance all meshing in together. You can see a copy of the three-way Venn diagram of the student engagement model here. You have the student, the teacher, and the content, and you see how they overlap to make that three-way Venn diagram where you will then have your relationship, expertise, and relevance that lead to your meaningful engagement. So you create those relationships, you link it to the prior knowledge, you use your formative assessments, and you check for the understanding, and you use a variety of interaction modes and models in your classroom to increase the engagement. And you make sure that the tasks are rigorous, active, and accountable. So by knowing your students and looking at the data, you want to make sure you're giving them activities that will push them to the next level. Of course, you don't want to have it to the point where they're just so frustrated that they give up, but they do need to experience that productive struggle so they can engage in the task and really push their learning and leap over those gaps. Final tier one strategies, well, not the final one, but the final one we're going to discuss today, is to have flexible grouping and differentiation. So when we talk about flexible grouping, we want to make sure that everything is equitable. Some students need a little bit more support than others. So this gives you the opportunity to scaffold students and to make sure that each student gets what they need. So you'll have students that you can push further and they can be enriched. You'll have students that you'll have to scaffold up to grade level. But whatever it is, you want to make sure that you do honor all of the differences of your students, and you want to facilitate the differentiation in a way that allows you to have ongoing and authentic assessment so that you can see your students reaching the levels that they need to reach. Um, you want to make sure that you can provide practical things, can be more practical than tutoring or remediation. It should be embedded inside of the class. Inside of the class, 80 to 85%. Remember, tier one, 80 to 85%, and it happens in the classroom. So, what are the four different ways that you can differentiate? So, pretty sure you've heard this before, but the first one is by content, number two, by process, number three, by product, and number four, by learning environment. So, let's delve into just a couple examples of each one so that you can recognize when you're differentiating by either one of these four aspects. One is differentiated by content. So remember, content is simply your state standards, what it is that the students need to know. And when you differentiate by content, you are providing them choice. There are many different ways for a student to get to the learning target. You may give them supplemental materials and additional resources that they would need in order to match their level of understanding. So that is one way that you can differentiate by content. The second method of differentiation is to differentiate by process. And when you differentiate by process, you're just giving the students a different way. It refers to the way that they actually make sense of the information. So you might teach it in different ways, or you give them different opportunities that fit their learning style preferences. Next way is to differentiate by product, and this is where your choice boards come in. When you differentiate by product, which is something that's normally tangible that the student is turning in or they are doing for you, such as a speech or explaining a presentation, you can differentiate the way in which the student shows that they have met that learning target and that they understand it. So it may come in the form of any options you can give the students. So they may do a project, they may write an essay, they may write a letter, they may do a lab, they may give a speech, they may do a demonstration. As long as it's hitting the same level of rigor and you have the same expectations and it's covering that learning target, which feeds back into that standard, you could differentiate by product. Lastly, there is differentiation by learning environment. And this is just dealing with the climate of your classroom, making sure it's a positive learning environment. You may have some whole group sections, a small group section. You may have a student that works better individually, so they have a quiet section where they can go and work individually. Anytime that you can differentiate by the learning environment to accommodate a student's learning style preference for that particular lesson, always a good thing. Other ways you're differentiated by learning environment is when you move your seating. You go from rows, then you go to groups, and then you do a carousel walk. Those hit different types of learns, but it's also differentiating your learning environment to make it conducive to whatever it is, the standard feeding into the learning target that you are trying to make sure that the students understand. Ultimately, as educators, we just want to make sure we reach the maximum number of students that we can reach. And just remember that whatever we do must be intentional, especially when it comes to the lessons that we plan and the formative assessments and the data and evidence that we gather. So just remember that your differentiation and all of your strategies should always be driven by data and evidence that you have collected so that it can inform the instruction so that you can maximize your instructional time and not spend time teaching the students things that they already know or not knowing what scaffolding and various supports that they need in order for them to reach their learning target. So until your next Solomon segment, toodles. So, what are the four, well, that's eight, four different ways that you can